I never thought a simple brunch invitation would become the moment my entire world shifted. When my daughter-in-law Ashley called that Saturday morning, her voice had that artificial sweetness she always used when she wanted something. "Margaret, why don't you join us for brunch tomorrow? The whole family will be there." I should have known something was wrong. Ashley rarely invited me anywhere, and when she did, it was usually because she needed me to watch the kids or help with something. But I was lonely. My husband Robert had passed away 3 years ago, and these family gatherings were often the only social interaction I had all week. I arrived at their house in Westchester at exactly 11, as requested. I'd spent an hour getting ready, choosing my navy blue dress carefully, making sure my hair looked nice. I even brought homemade banana bread for the kids, just like I always did. The recipe was my mother's, something I'd been making for David since he was little. The house was buzzing with activity. Ashley's friends from her book club, some neighbors, a few couples from David's work.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
I felt immediately out of place among these younger, more stylish people, but I tried to smile and blend in. They were all discussing things I couldn't relate to. Someone's new Tesla, a vacation to the Hamptons, the latest restaurant opening in Soho. David, my son, gave me a quick hug at the door. "Hi, Mom. Glad you could make it." But his attention was already elsewhere, pulled away by someone calling his name from the kitchen. I watched him walk away, his hand already reaching for his phone. I found myself standing alone by the entrance, holding my banana bread like some awkward gift nobody wanted. The conversations flowed around me in waves I couldn't catch. When I tried to contribute, mentioning my volunteer work at the library or asking about their children, my comments were met with polite smiles and quick subject changes. Ashley was playing hostess perfectly, gliding between groups with her blonde hair perfectly styled and her laugh ringing out at just the right moments. She looked so confident, so in control of her domain. I remembered when David first brought her home 5 years ago, how I'd tried so hard to make her feel welcome, to be the mother-in-law I'd never had myself. I made my way to the kitchen, thinking maybe I could help with something. The granite countertops were covered with expensive-looking dishes, smoked salmon, fresh fruit arrangements, pastries that clearly came from an upscale bakery. My banana bread looked embarrassingly homemade next to all of it. "Oh, Margaret," Ashley appeared beside me, her voice cutting through my thoughts. "Can we talk for a minute?" I could see something in her eyes that made my stomach tighten. She had that look she got when she was about to say something she'd been rehearsing. I'd seen it before, usually right before she corrected me about something I'd said to the kids, or suggested a different way I should handle something. "Of course, dear," I said, though every instinct told me this wasn't going to be good. She guided me slightly away from the kitchen, but not far enough that we were truly private. Several people were within earshot, pretending not to listen, but I could feel their attention shifting toward us. "Look, I know you mean well, but you always make things awkward on holidays. The way you criticize how I cook the turkey, or make comments about how we're raising the kids differently than you did. And then there's always some drama or tension whenever you're around." I felt my face flush hot. The words hit me like physical blows. Several people had stopped their conversations entirely now and were openly listening. My daughter-in-law was calling me out in front of strangers, treating me like a problematic child who needed to be managed. "I don't think I criticize," I started to say, my voice barely above a whisper, but she held up her hand to stop me. "Please, just let me finish. Thanksgiving is coming up, and honestly, we just want to have a peaceful holiday for once. The kids are at such a good age now, and David's been so stressed with work. Maybe you could spend it somewhere else this year. Give us some space to enjoy the day without walking on eggshells." The room had gone completely quiet now. I could feel every pair of eyes on me. Could practically hear people thinking about how they'd retell this story later. The elderly mother-in-law being put in her place by the young, sophisticated wife. I was becoming their entertainment, their cautionary tale about overbearing mothers. "Let us have peace this year," Ashley concluded, as if she was doing me a tremendous favor by explaining it so clearly. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, still holding that stupid banana bread, feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my entire life. This was my son's house, but I was being asked to leave not just the brunch, but the holiday itself, in front of all these people who didn't even know me, who would never know that I'd spent every Christmas morning for the past 5 years cooking breakfast for this family, that I'd driven through snowstorms to babysit when they wanted date nights, that I'd never once complained when plans changed at the last minute. Something broke inside me at that moment, not dramatically, not with tears or shouting. It was quieter than that, more profound. It was the sound of the last thread connecting me to the hope that I mattered to this family finally snapping. The thread I'd been holding on to so desperately since Robert died, thinking that surely my only child would need me, would want me in his life. I didn't say a word. I simply set the banana bread down on the nearest table, next to a crystal bowl of mixed nuts that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. I picked up my purse from where I'd placed it by the door and walked toward the exit. "Mom, where are you going?" David called after me, but he didn't sound concerned. He sounded annoyed that I was making a scene, embarrassed by his difficult mother who couldn't take a hint. I didn't turn around. I didn't explain myself. I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I just walked out of that house and got into my car, my hand surprisingly steady as I put the key in the ignition. As I sat in their circular driveway, watching their perfect house with its perfect landscaping in my rearview mirror, I realized something that scared me more than Ashley's public humiliation. I realized I wasn't surprised. Deep down, I'd been waiting for this moment for years. The moment when they'd finally say out loud what their actions had been telling me all along. I wasn't wanted. The drive home was a blur of tree-lined streets and traffic lights. I drove carefully, mechanically, not trusting myself to think too much about what had just happened. When I pulled into my empty garage and turned off the engine, the silence was deafening. I sat there in the dark for a long time, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, finally letting myself cry. Not for Ashley, who had never really liked me anyway, not even for David's failure to defend me, though that cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I cried for the woman I'd become, someone so desperate for family connection that I'd accepted crumbs of affection and called it love. But as the tears slowed and I sat there in the quiet darkness of my garage, something else began to stir beneath the hurt. A memory that had been buried under 3 years of grief and loneliness started to surface. Robert's voice, just weeks before he died, telling me something I'd pushed aside in the overwhelming sadness of losing him. "Promise me, Maggie," he'd whispered from his hospital bed, his hand squeezing mine with what little strength he had left. "Promise me you won't let them treat you like you don't matter. You're stronger than you know, and you have more power than you realize. I've made sure of that." At the time, I'd thought he was just being sentimental, the way dying people sometimes are when they want to comfort the ones they're leaving behind. But now, sitting alone in my dark garage after the most humiliating experience of my life, I began to wonder if Robert had seen something I'd been too blind to see, too wrapped up in grief to understand. Maybe it was time I found out exactly what he meant by that promise, and what kind of power he thought I had. The house felt impossibly quiet when I walked through the front door. I'd lived here for 32 years, raised David within these walls, but suddenly it felt like a museum of my own life. Everything was exactly as Robert and I had left it, and yet everything felt different after what had happened at brunch. I walked through the living room, past the piano David used to play as a child, past the family photos that now seemed to mock me with their frozen smiles. Had we ever really been as happy as we looked in those pictures? Or had I been fooling myself even then? I found myself in Robert's study, a room I'd barely entered since his death. It still smelled like his cologne and old books. His reading glasses were still on the desk where he'd left them, next to a stack of financial documents I'd never had the courage to go through. Sitting in his leather chair, I let the memories wash over me. Not the sanitized versions I usually allowed myself, but the real ones. The complicated truth of how I'd gotten to this point. David had been such a loving child. I remembered how he used to crawl into our bed on Sunday mornings, how he'd beg me to read him just one more story. When did that change? When did I become the inconvenience instead of the comfort? I knew exactly when. It was when Ashley entered the picture. At first, I'd been thrilled that David had found someone. He'd dated sporadically through college and his early 20s, but nothing serious. When he brought Ashley home for the first time, I saw how his face lit up when he looked at her. I wanted to love her for that alone. Ashley was everything I wasn't. Young, confident, with a career in marketing that paid more than Robert and I had ever made. She had opinions about everything: restaurants, politics, child rearing, interior design. At first, I'd found it refreshing. David seemed energized by her certainty about the world. But slowly, I began to notice things. The way Ashley would redirect conversations when I spoke. How she'd make subtle corrections to things I said in front of David. The way she'd suggest better ways to do things I'd been doing successfully for decades. When little Emma was born, I thought things might change. Surely becoming a grandmother would secure my place in this new family structure. I volunteered to help with everything: babysitting, cooking meals, shopping for baby clothes. I was so grateful to be needed again. But even that became complicated. Ashley had very specific ideas about child rearing that didn't match how I'd raised David. When I gave Emma a bottle, I was holding her wrong. When I picked out clothes, they weren't the right style. When I suggested taking her for a walk, it was too cold, too hot, too close to nap time. I started walking on eggshells in my own son's house. I learned to ask permission before doing anything with my own granddaughter. I accepted that my way of doing things was outdated, inferior to Ashley's modern methods. The worst part was watching David change. He began seeing me through Ashley's eyes, as someone who meant well but didn't quite understand how things worked in their world. My suggestions became mom's ideas, delivered with an apologetic smile as if he needed to explain my limitations to his wife. When Tommy was born 2 years later, the pattern was already established. I was the grandmother who needed to be managed, whose help came with conditions and corrections. I told myself I was grateful just to be included, but deep down, I was dying a slow death of 1,000 small rejections. Robert saw it happening. "She's isolating you, Maggie," he'd said one evening after a particularly tense family dinner. "David can't see it because he's caught in the middle, but she's systematically erasing your influence." I'd defended Ashley then, told Robert he was being unfair. "She was just particular," I said. "She wanted things done her way in her own home, and that was reasonable." But Robert had shaken his head sadly. "You're making excuses for someone who doesn't respect you," he'd said. "And worse, you're teaching David that it's acceptable to treat you this way." Now, sitting in his chair 3 years after his death, I realized how right he'd been. I had trained my own family to disrespect me by accepting every slight, every dismissal, every boundary they drew around my role in their lives. I opened the desk drawer, something I'd avoided doing since Robert's funeral. Inside were the documents his lawyer had given me, papers I'd been too overwhelmed to examine properly. Most of it was routine: insurance policies, bank statements, the deed to the house. But at the bottom was an envelope with my name written in Robert's careful handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just 2 weeks before he died. "My dearest Maggie," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you're finally ready to face what I've been trying to tell you. You are not helpless. You are not dependent on David and Ashley's approval. You have more control over your life than you realize." I felt my hands trembling as I continued reading. "I've been watching what they do to you, how they diminish you little by little, and it breaks my heart. But I've also been preparing for this day. The college funds I set up for Emma and Tommy aren't just savings accounts, Maggie. They're trust funds, and you are the sole trustee until the children turn 25. My breath caught in my throat. I'd known Robert had been saving for the grandchildren's education, but I'd assumed control of that money would pass automatically to David and Ashley. "This isn't about punishing anyone," the letter continued. "It's about ensuring you have a voice in your grandchildren's lives that can't be dismissed or undermined. You decide how the money is used, when it's accessed, and under what conditions. No one can change this without your consent." I set the letter down, my mind reeling. Robert had given me something I'd never had before: real power in the family dynamic, not the kind that came from being needed or useful, but the kind that came from being legally necessary. I thought about Emma and Tommy, ages 5 and 3 now. Ashley was already talking about private schools, expensive summer camps, college prep programs, all things that would require accessing the trust funds Robert had established. For the first time since walking out of that brunch, I felt something other than hurt and humiliation. I felt a strange sense of possibility, as if Robert was reaching across the divide between life and death to hand me the tools I needed to reclaim my dignity. But this wasn't about revenge. As I sat in Robert's chair, surrounded by the life we'd built together, I realized what he'd really given me wasn't the power to punish David and Ashley. He'd given me the power to demand respect, not just for myself, but for the memory of the woman I used to be before I learned to make myself small. The question now was whether I had the courage to use it. I spent the next 3 days avoiding my phone entirely. It rang constantly. David, Ashley, even my sister Joan, who lived in Florida and somehow already knew about the brunch incident. I let every call go to voicemail, not ready to hear their excuses or explanations or demands that I be reasonable about the situation. Instead, I did something I hadn't done in years. I focused entirely on myself. I read Robert's letter at least a dozen times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. He'd been planning this for months before his death, maybe even years. The trust documents were dated from when Emma was just a baby, long before the family dynamics had become as toxic as they were now. Robert had seen the writing on the wall when I was still making excuses for everyone. On Wednesday morning, I called the number on the business card Robert's lawyer had given me at the funeral, James Morrison, estate planning attorney. I'd barely spoken to him that day, too overwhelmed with grief to focus on legal details. "Mrs. Patterson," his voice was warm when I identified myself. "I've been wondering when you might call. How are you holding up? I'm ready to understand exactly what Robert set up for me," I said directly. "I found his letter." There was a pause. "Ah, I wondered if he'd left you something like that. He was very concerned about your well-being after he was gone. Can you come in this afternoon? I think we should discuss this in person." James Morrison's office was in downtown White Plains, a 20-minute drive that gave me time to think about what I wanted to say. I'd spent so many years deferring to other people's opinions that forming my own thoughts felt rusty, uncertain. Morrison was a kind man in his 60s, with gray hair and gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He offered me coffee and settled behind his desk with a thick file. "Your husband was very specific about his intentions," he began. "The trust funds for Emma and Tommy currently contain about $250,000 combined, and they continue to grow with the investments Robert chose. But the most important thing to understand is that you have complete discretionary control over how and when those funds are accessed." I felt my mouth go dry. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means if David and Ashley want to enroll the children in private school and need trust funds to pay tuition, they have to come to you. If they want to access money for summer camps, educational trips, tutoring, even college expenses, they need your approval. Every single time. But surely they can contest that. Get it changed somehow?" Morrison shook his head. "Robert was very thorough. The trust is ironclad. The only way it can be modified is with your written consent. He specifically included provisions preventing anyone from pressuring you or attempting to remove you as trustee." I sat back in my chair, trying to process this information. For 5 years, I'd been treated like an optional accessory to my grandchildren's lives. Now I was legally essential to their future. "There's more," Morrison continued. "Robert also established very specific guidelines about how the trust can be used. The money is designated for educational purposes, but that's defined broadly: school, camps, cultural activities, even family trips that have educational value. But Robert included a clause requiring that any use of the funds must be consistent with maintaining healthy family relationships and respect for family elders." What does that mean in practical terms? It means you have grounds to deny access to the funds if you feel the family dynamic is unhealthy or disrespectful. Robert was essentially giving you veto power over major decisions affecting the children until they're adults. I felt tears prick my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude for a husband who had understood what I hadn't even understood about myself, that I deserved respect, not just tolerance. "Has David tried to contact you about this?" Morrison asked. "He doesn't know yet," I admitted. "We had a falling out over the weekend. I haven't spoken to anyone since Sunday." Morrison nodded knowingly. "Robert thought something like this might happen. He left specific instructions about how he wanted you to handle the revelation of the trust structure. He handed me another envelope with my name on it. Inside was a shorter note in Robert's handwriting. Maggie, don't use this as a weapon. Use it as a shield. The goal isn't to punish them, but to protect yourself and ensure you can be the grandmother Emma and Tommy deserve to have. They need you in their lives, but they need the real you, not the diminished version of yourself you've become. Love, Robert. I held the note against my chest, feeling Robert's presence in the room as if he were sitting beside me, holding my hand the way he used to during difficult conversations. What would you recommend I do? I asked Morrison. I think you should take some time to decide what kind of relationship you want with your family moving forward. Then, when you're ready, you should have a conversation with David and Ashley about the new reality, not from a position of anger or revenge, but from a position of self-respect. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through neighborhoods I'd driven through for decades, but rarely really seen. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I had agency in my own life, not just the ability to react to what others decided for me, but the power to make decisions that others would have to respect. When I got home, I finally listened to my voicemails. David's voice, increasingly frustrated over 3 days. Mom, call me back. We need to talk about Sunday. Then, Mom, Ashley feels terrible about how things went. Just call me, okay? And finally, Mom, this is ridiculous. You can't just disappear because you didn't like what you heard. Ashley had left one message, her voice carefully controlled. Margaret, I think there was a misunderstanding on Sunday. David and I would like to clear the air. Please call us when you're ready to have a mature conversation. A mature conversation. As if I were the child who had thrown a tantrum instead of the adult who had been publicly humiliated in front of strangers. I deleted all the messages without returning any of the calls. Instead, I made a different call to my sister Joan in Florida. Maggie! Her voice was warm with relief. I've been worried sick. David called me yesterday asking if I'd heard from you. What did you tell him? I told him maybe if he treated his mother better, she wouldn't feel the need to disappear. He didn't like that very much. I smiled despite myself. Joan had never liked Ashley, had seen through her polite facade from the beginning, but she'd held her tongue for my sake, knowing I needed to come to my own conclusions. Joan, I said slowly, what would you say if I told you I was thinking about spending Thanksgiving with you this year? There was silence on the other end. Then Joan's voice, fierce with protection. I'd say it's about damn time you put yourself first for once. And I'd start planning the best Thanksgiving menu you've ever had. For the first time in days, I laughed. Really laughed. Maybe Ashley was right about one thing. Maybe it was time for some peace during the holidays. The question was, whose peace mattered more? By Thursday, the calls had stopped coming. I should have felt relieved, but instead I felt a hollow sadness that my own son could give up on me so easily. 3 days of silence from me, and he'd apparently decided I wasn't worth the effort. I was wrong. Thursday evening, just as I was settling down with a cup of tea and a book I'd been meaning to read for months, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see David standing on my front porch, shifting his weight from foot to foot the way he used to when he was nervous as a child. I considered not answering. I wasn't ready for this conversation yet, hadn't fully processed everything Morrison had told me or decided how I wanted to handle the situation, but something in David's posture made me open the door. Hi, Mom. He looked tired, older than his 32 years. Can I come in? I stepped aside without saying anything, and he followed me into the living room. We sat in the same chairs Robert and I used to occupy every evening, David in Robert's recliner, me on the end of the sofa closest to him. You can't just disappear like that, he said without preamble. I've been worried about you. Have you? The question came out sharper than I intended. David flinched. Of course I have. You're my mother. I wasn't sure you remembered that on Sunday. We sat in silence for a moment. David leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring at his hands. When he finally looked up, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. Uncertainty. Ashley says you misunderstood what she was trying to say. I felt a familiar surge of anger, the same feeling I'd had when Ashley dismissed me at the brunch. Did she now? And what exactly did I misunderstand about being told I make things awkward and should spend Thanksgiving somewhere else? She just meant, David. I cut him off, my voice quieter than I expected. Don't. Please don't insult my intelligence by pretending that wasn't exactly what she meant to say. David was quiet for a long moment. She thinks you don't approve of how we're raising the kids. And what do you think? I think... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I think maybe you both could try harder to get along. There it was, the careful neutrality that had characterized David's approach to family conflict for years, never taking sides, never acknowledging that one person might be more wrong than the other, always asking me to be the bigger person, to try harder, to understand Ashley's perspective. David, I said gently, when was the last time you asked Ashley to try harder to get along with me? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. We both knew the answer. I love those children more than anything, I continued. And I love you. But I'm tired of being treated like a problem that needs to be managed rather than a person who deserves basic respect. Mom, that's not... It is, though. I felt surprisingly calm, as if Robert's letter had given me permission to speak truths I'd been avoiding for years. When I offer to help with Emma's homework, Ashley corrects my methods. When I suggest activities for the kids, she explains why her ideas are better. When I bring them gifts, she finds reasons why they're inappropriate. I'm not imagining this, David. David looked uncomfortable, shifting in his chair. Ashley has strong opinions about things. That doesn't mean she doesn't value you. When did you start seeing me through her eyes instead of your own? The question hung in the air between us. David's face went through several expressions: surprise, defensiveness, and finally something that looked like recognition. I don't know what you want me to say, Mom. I want you to think about whether the mother who raised you, who spent 25 years putting your needs first, who supported every dream you ever had, is really the kind of person who would deliberately make family gatherings awkward. David was quiet for so long I thought he might not respond at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller than it had been before. Ashley says you criticize the way she does things. When? When you suggest different ways to... He trailed off, and I could see him realizing what I'd been trying to tell him. The difference between criticism and simply existing with my own experiences and opinions. David, I said softly, I've been a mother for 32 years. I've been a grandmother for 5. When I suggest that Emma might enjoy a book I remember you loving, or mention that Tommy seems tired and might need an earlier bedtime, I'm not criticizing Ashley. I'm sharing what I know from caring for children I love. But Ashley feels like I'm a threat to her authority, and instead of addressing that with her directly, you've all decided it's easier to minimize my role in the family. David looked stricken. That's not what we intended, but it's what happened. I could see him struggling, torn between the reality I was presenting and the version of events he'd been accepting for years. It was painful to watch, this moment when a grown man realizes he's been failing someone he loves. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted. I'm not asking you to fix anything, I said. I'm asking you to think about what kind of relationship you want to have with me going forward. Because I won't keep accepting crumbs of affection and pretending they're enough. David's phone buzzed, and I watched him glance at it automatically. Ashley, no doubt, checking on how the conversation was going. Are you going to answer that? I asked. He looked at the phone, then at me, and deliberately turned it face down on the coffee table. It was such a small gesture, but it meant everything. For the first time in years, David was choosing to focus entirely on our conversation without managing Ashley's anxiety about it. What do you want, Mom? He asked. Realistically, what would make this better? I thought about Robert's letter, about the trust funds, about the power I now knew I had. But I also thought about what I really wanted, underneath all the hurt and anger. I want to be treated like a member of this family, not a problem the family has to solve. I want my suggestions to be considered, not automatically dismissed. I want to be able to love my grandchildren without being micromanaged. And I want you to remember that I'm your mother, not Ashley's project to manage. David nodded slowly. And if Ashley can't do that, it was the question I'd been dreading, but also the one that needed to be asked. Then you'll have to decide what's more important to you, I said quietly. Your wife's comfort or your mother's dignity? That's not fair. No, I agreed. It's not. But it's where we are. David left 20 minutes later, promising to think about everything I'd said. As I watched him drive away, I realized something had shifted during our conversation. I'd spoken my truth without anger, without demands for immediate change, without threats about what would happen if things didn't improve. But I'd also made it clear that the status quo was no longer acceptable. Now I had to wait and see what David would do with that information. I didn't hear from David for 4 days after our conversation. Part of me worried that I'd pushed too hard, demanded too much, but a larger part of me felt strangely peaceful. For the first time in years, I'd spoken my complete truth to my son without softening the edges or making excuses for anyone's behavior. On Monday morning, I was in my garden pulling up the last of the summer flowers when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. Through the hedge, I could see Ashley's white SUV. My stomach tightened, but I didn't stop what I was doing. If she wanted to have this conversation, she could come find me. She appeared around the side of the house a few minutes later, looking perfectly put together as always in her cream-colored sweater and dark jeans. But there was something different about her expression. The usual confidence was replaced by something harder to read. "Margaret," she said, stopping a few feet away from where I knelt in the dirt. "Ashley," I kept working, pulling up marigold stems and dropping them into my garden basket. "We need to talk, do we?" I glanced up at her briefly, then returned to my flowers. "David has been different since he talked to you last week. Distant. He's questioning things that were never problems before." I sat back on my heels and really looked at her. Ashley was trying to maintain her usual composed demeanor, but I could see cracks in it. Her mouth was tighter than usual, her hands clasped a little too firmly in front of her. "What kinds of things?" I asked. "He's suddenly concerned about whether we're including you enough in family decisions. He's questioning my parenting choices, asking why I don't like your suggestions about the kids. It's like you've poisoned him against me." I felt a surge of something that might have been satisfaction, but I pushed it down. This wasn't about winning or losing. At least it shouldn't be. "I told David the truth about how I've been feeling," I said calmly. "If that's causing problems in your marriage, maybe you should think about why." Ashley's composure cracked a little further. "You want me to apologize for having standards for my children? For wanting what's best for them? I want you to recognize that having different ideas doesn't make me wrong or disruptive. It just makes me a person with my own experiences. Your experiences are from 30 years ago, Margaret. Child rearing has evolved." There it was, the fundamental disrespect that had been lurking under all of Ashley's polite interactions with me. In her mind, everything I knew was outdated, irrelevant, worthless. I stood up slowly, brushing the dirt off my gardening gloves. "Ashley, I successfully raised a kind, intelligent, successful man who you fell in love with and married. Maybe my methods weren't completely wrong." She opened her mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. "What do you want from me?" she asked instead. It was the same question David had asked, but Ashley's tone was different. David had sounded genuinely confused and willing to change. Ashley sounded like someone being forced to negotiate with a terrorist. "I want basic respect," I said simply. "I want to be able to suggest activities for my grandchildren without being told why my ideas won't work. I want to be able to share my experiences without being dismissed as old-fashioned. I want to be treated like a member of this family instead of an outsider you have to tolerate. I've never been disrespectful to you." The denial was so complete, so confident, that for a moment I wondered if Ashley actually believed it. Did she really not see the pattern of dismissals and corrections and subtle undermining that had characterized our relationship? "Ashley," I said carefully, "last Sunday you told me in front of a room full of strangers that I make family gatherings awkward and should spend Thanksgiving somewhere else. If that's not disrespectful, what would you call it?" I was trying to address a problem before it got worse. "What problem?" "The tension you create when you're around. The way you make everyone walk on eggshells." I stared at her, genuinely bewildered. "What tension? What eggshells?" "The way you hover when I'm parenting the kids. The comments you make about how things were different when David was little. The way you act like I don't know what I'm doing." For the first time, I began to understand what had been happening all these years. Ashley wasn't deliberately trying to hurt me. She was interpreting every interaction through the lens of her own insecurities about being a good mother. My presence, my experience, my natural comfort with children, it all felt like judgment to her. But understanding the reason didn't excuse the behavior. "Ashley," I said gently, "I've never once said you don't know what you're doing. I've never criticized your parenting. When I share stories about David or suggest activities for Emma and Tommy, it's not criticism. It's connection. It feels like criticism. Then that's something you need to work on, not something you need to manage by excluding me." Ashley's face flushed. "So this is my fault? My problem to fix?" "The insecurity is yours to address," I said. "But the way you've treated me because of that insecurity, that's a choice you made. And it's a choice you can unmake." We stood there in my garden, surrounded by the dying flowers of summer, having the conversation that should have happened years ago. I could see Ashley struggling with the idea that she might have been wrong, that her perspective might not be the only valid one. "David wants us to have dinner together this week," she said finally. "All of us. To work things out. And what do you want?" "I want things to go back to the way they were." "That's not going to happen," I said firmly. "I won't go back to accepting disrespect just to keep the peace." Ashley's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it automatically. Then her expression changed completely. The color drained from her face. "What's wrong?" I asked. She was staring at her phone, reading something that was clearly upsetting her. "It's from David," she said slowly. "He says he got a call from someone named James Morrison about college funds for the kids." My heart stopped. I'd forgotten that Morrison had mentioned sending some routine paperwork to David about the trusts. In all the emotional upheaval of the past week, it had slipped my mind completely. "He wants to know why a lawyer is telling him that you control Emma and Tommy's education funds," Ashley continued, her voice getting smaller. "Margaret, what is he talking about?" I looked at Ashley's face, the confusion, the growing fear as she began to understand that the family dynamics she thought she controlled might be more complicated than she'd realized. "It's something Robert set up before he died," I said quietly. "I only found out about it myself last week." "What exactly did he set up?" I could have lied. I could have minimized it, made it sound less significant than it was, but I was done protecting other people from uncomfortable truths. "He established trust funds for the children's education and named me as the sole trustee. Any access to those funds has to be approved by me." Ashley sat down heavily on my garden bench, still staring at her phone. "How much money are we talking about? Enough to pay for private school, college, graduate school if they want it. Everything you've been planning for their futures, and you control all of it?" "Yes." Ashley looked up at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely frightened. "Are you going to use this against us? Because of what happened on Sunday?" It was the moment of truth. I could see the fear in Ashley's eyes, the realization that the grandmother she'd been dismissing and marginalizing for years now held significant power over her children's futures. "That depends," I said slowly, "on whether you're willing to have a real conversation about respect. Not just this surface-level discussion we're having now, but a genuine examination of how this family treats each other." Ashley nodded quickly. Yes, we can do that." "And you understand that this conversation has to include David? That we can't keep having these separate negotiations where everyone tries to manage everyone else's feelings?" "I understand." "Good." I picked up my garden basket and started walking toward the house. "Tell David I'll come to dinner on Friday." "But Ashley?" She looked up at me expectantly. "This is your one chance to get this right. I won't keep having the same conversation over and over while nothing actually changes." Friday evening arrived with an unexpected calmness. I'd spent the week preparing for this dinner not by rehearsing what I wanted to say, but by truly understanding what I needed from this family going forward. Robert's trust had given me leverage, but more importantly, it had given me clarity about my own worth. I arrived at David and Ashley's house at 6 o'clock, carrying a small bouquet of flowers from my garden. Not the elaborate homemade offerings I used to bring, desperately hoping for approval. Just something simple and beautiful that I wanted to share. Emma and Tommy ran to greet me at the door, their faces lighting up in a way that reminded me why this was all worth fighting for. These children loved me unconditionally, without the complications their parents had created. Grandma Maggie, Emma threw her arms around my waist. Mom said you're going to have dinner with us every Friday now. I looked up to see Ashley standing in the hallway, her expression carefully neutral. We thought it might be nice to have regular family dinners, she said. It was a small thing, but significant. Ashley was already trying to establish new patterns, to show me that things could be different. David appeared behind her, and I could see the nervousness in his eyes. He'd clearly been dreading this conversation all week, uncertain how it would go and what it might mean for his marriage and his relationship with me. "Hi, Mom," he said, giving me a hug that lasted a few seconds longer than usual. "Thanks for coming." We gathered in their dining room, around the table where so many tense family meals had played out over the years. But tonight felt different. The children chattered excitedly about their week while Ashley served a simple dinner of roasted chicken and vegetables. No elaborate display designed to impress, just a family meal. After the kids finished eating and went to play in the living room, the three of us sat with coffee and the conversation I'd been both dreading and anticipating finally began. Morrison explained the trust situation to me, David said without preamble. I had no idea Dad had set it up that way. Neither did I until last week, I admitted. He left me a letter explaining everything. Ashley looked down at her coffee cup. David says you could have used it as leverage from the beginning, but you didn't. Because this isn't about money or control, I said. It's about respect and relationships. David leaned forward. Help me understand what that looks like practically. What needs to change? I'd been thinking about this question for days, trying to move beyond my hurt feelings to identify specific, actionable changes that would make our family dynamic healthier. I want to be consulted about decisions that affect the children, not just informed after the fact, I said. When you're choosing schools or activities or planning family trips, I'd like to be part of the conversation. Ashley nodded slowly. That seems reasonable. I want my suggestions and ideas to be considered on their merits, not dismissed because they're different from what you would do. I might not always be right, but I deserve to be heard. Okay, David said. What else? I want to be able to spend time with Emma and Tommy without being supervised or corrected constantly. I successfully raised your father, David. I think I can handle an afternoon with my grandchildren. Ashley shifted uncomfortably. Sometimes it feels like you're undermining my authority with them. How? When you let them do things I've said no to, or when you suggest different ways of handling situations. I could see we were getting to the heart of Ashley's insecurity. Ashley, can you give me a specific example of when I've undermined your authority? She was quiet for a long moment. Last month when Emma wanted to climb that tree in your backyard, I told her it was too dangerous, but you said it was fine and helped her up, because I assessed the situation differently than you did, I said gently. The tree has strong branches and Emma is a capable climber. That wasn't undermining you. It was making a judgment call based on my own experience and comfort level. But it made me look like the overprotective one. Ashley, David interjected. That's not Mom's responsibility to manage. I was surprised to hear David push back against Ashley's interpretation. It was the first time I'd seen him choose clarity over peacekeeping. You're right, Ashley said quietly. I guess I've been looking for criticism that wasn't there. Why? I asked. Not unkindly. Ashley was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. Because you make it look so easy. The way the kids gravitate toward you, the way they light up when you're around. I work so hard to be a good mother, and sometimes it feels like they love you more effortlessly than they love me. The honesty in her admission took my breath away. For the first time, I saw Ashley not as the confident young woman who had displaced me in my son's affections, but as an insecure mother, desperately trying to prove herself worthy of love. Ashley, I said gently, the children adore you. You're their world. But loving me doesn't take anything away from loving you. Love isn't a limited resource. I know that intellectually, she said, but it doesn't always feel that way. David reached over and took Ashley's hand. You're an amazing mother. Mom's not your competition. I think, I said carefully, part of the problem has been that we've all been acting like there's only room for one woman's influence in this family. But that's not true. Emma and Tommy are lucky to have a mother who cares so deeply about their well-being, and a grandmother who brings different experiences and perspectives to their lives. Ashley nodded, tears starting to gather in her eyes. I'm sorry, Margaret. I've been so focused on protecting my role that I didn't see how I was hurting yours. And I've been so hurt by feeling excluded that I probably did come across as critical sometimes, even when I didn't mean to. David looked between us with something like relief. So, where do we go from here? We start over, I said, with the understanding that we're all on the same team, Team Emma and Tommy, and that team works best when everyone's strengths are valued. Ashley wiped her eyes. What about the trust funds? How do we handle that going forward? The way Robert intended, I said. When you need to access money for the children's education, you come to me. We discuss it together, make decisions together. I'm not going to be arbitrary or controlling about it, but I am going to be involved. That seems fair, David said. There's one more thing, I added. The trust documents include a provision about maintaining healthy family relationships. Robert specifically wanted to ensure that the children grew up understanding the importance of respecting family elders. He saw what was happening to our family dynamic, and he wanted to prevent it from getting worse. Ashley looked stricken. You could have used that against us after Sunday. I could have, I agreed. But that would have made me the kind of person who uses money to manipulate relationships. That's not who I want to be, and it's not what Robert intended. What did he intend? David asked. I thought about Robert's letter, about his hopes for our family's future. He wanted to make sure that respect and love flow in both directions, that the children learn to value wisdom and experience, not just youth and novelty, and that all of us remember that family relationships require effort and care from everyone involved. Ashley stood up abruptly. I need to show you something, she said, leaving the room. She returned a few minutes later with a photo album I'd never seen before. I've been keeping this for the kids, she said, opening it to reveal pages of photos of me with Emma and Tommy over the years. Pictures I didn't even know she'd taken, me reading to them, helping them in the garden, teaching Emma to knit, showing Tommy how to build with blocks. You've been documenting our relationship? I asked, surprised. I wanted them to remember how much their grandmother loved them, Ashley said, even when I was being stupid about feeling threatened by that love. Looking at those pictures, I saw something I'd forgotten in all the hurt and tension of recent years. I saw genuine joy on my face, and on the children's faces, in moments I'd been too worried about Ashley's approval to fully appreciate at the time. They're beautiful, I said. There's one more thing, Ashley said, flipping to the back of the album. There was an envelope with my name on it. I wrote this after Sunday, before I knew about the trust funds. I was going to give it to you as an apology, but then everything got complicated. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter from Ashley. Dear Margaret, it began. I've been a terrible daughter-in-law, and I'm sorry. I let my own insecurities make me see you as a threat instead of a gift. Emma and Tommy are lucky to have you as their grandmother, and I've been lucky to have you as family. Even though I haven't acted like it, I hope you can forgive me and give us another chance to get this right. I looked up at Ashley, who was watching me nervously. You wrote this before you knew about the money? She nodded. David helped me understand some things after your conversation last week, about how I'd been treating you and how that wasn't okay regardless of my feelings. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I'd been carrying for years finally beginning to release. This wasn't about the trust funds or the power Robert had given me. This was about recognition, acknowledgement, the possibility of genuine change. I accept your apology, I said. And I hope you can accept mine for not speaking up sooner about how I was feeling. David was smiling now, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. So we're really going to try this? Weekly dinners, shared decisions, treating each other like family instead of adversaries? We are, Ashley said firmly. And Margaret, I want you to know, you're always welcome at Thanksgiving or any other holiday. This is your family too. 6 months later, I stood in Ashley and David's kitchen helping Emma frost cupcakes for her 6th birthday party. Ashley was at the stove making her famous mac and cheese while David assembled party favors at the kitchen table. Tommy was on the floor playing with blocks, occasionally asking me to admire his latest tower. Grandma Maggie, Emma said, carefully spreading pink frosting on her cupcake. Will you tell the story about Daddy when he was little and got his head stuck in the fence? Ashley laughed from the stove. Yes, please tell that one. I love watching David's face when you get to the part about the fire department. This was our new normal: weekly family dinners, shared decision-making about the children's activities and education, and most importantly, genuine respect and affection between all of us. Ashley still had her strong opinions about child-rearing, but now she asked for my input instead of dismissing it. David no longer felt caught between his wife and his mother, because there was no longer a battle for him to mediate. The trust funds had become a tool for collaboration rather than control. When Emma wanted to start piano lessons, Ashley and I researched teachers together. When Tommy showed interest in soccer, David and I visited different programs to find the best fit. Every decision was made as a team, with everyone's input valued. Robert had been right. The real power wasn't in the money or the legal documents. It was in understanding my own worth and refusing to accept anything less than genuine respect. The trust funds had simply given me the leverage I needed to demand that respect and the time necessary for everyone to adjust to the new dynamic. I was no longer the grandmother on the periphery, grateful for whatever scraps of inclusion I was offered. I was the family matriarch, respected, valued, and genuinely loved. Not because I controlled access to money, but because I'd finally learned to control access to myself. And as I watched Emma carefully decorating her cupcakes with the concentration she'd inherited from her father and the artistic flair she'd gotten from me, I knew Robert would be proud of the woman I'd become and the family we'd managed to rebuild together.